Poverty in Africa. Causes, challenges, and consequences. Imagine waking up every day, not knowing where your next meal will come from. For millions in Africa, this is a harsh reality. Despite the continent's vast natural resources, poverty continues to affect much of the population. Today we'll explore why Africa, rich in resources, remains a continent where many still struggle to survive. Poverty across Africa is marked by a pervasive inability to meet basic human needs. Despite the continent's abundance of natural resources, African nations consistently underperform in economic indicators like income or GDP per capita. In 2009, 22 of the 24 nations classified by the United Nations, UN, as having low human development were in Sub-Saharan Africa. By 2019, approximately 424 million individuals in the region lived in extreme poverty, a figure that rose to 460 million by 2022, driven by the economic disruptions of the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. In 2006, Africa accounted for 34 of the 50 countries designated as least developed by the UN. Most African nations report GDP per capita figures below $5,200 annually, with many citizens subsisting on far less. By 2016, only Seychelles exceeded $10,000 in GDP per capita. The continent's share of global income has been in steady decline over the past century. For example, while a European worker earned about 3 times as much as an African worker in 1820, this disparity has since expanded to a 20-fold difference. Though Africa's GDP per capita has shown incremental growth, it remains far behind other regions. Land mismanagement and ownership challenges. Although Sub-Saharan Africa boasts vast tracts of arable land, individual land ownership is rare. Most land is communally owned by tribes, and many nations lack systems that allow free land ownership. In some cases, laws prohibit land ownership for specific groups, though enforcement is inconsistent. Even when disadvantaged individuals purchase land, they often lack legal documentation proving ownership. This absence of clear titles leaves many rural Africans dependent on farm labor jobs. Despite an abundance of unused land, much of it is privately held or poorly managed. Weak land registration systems exacerbate issues like squatting and land disputes, while the lack of ownership limits individuals' ability to secure loans or mortgages. Inefficient land reform efforts often favor politically connected individuals over those in need. For instance, Zimbabwe's controversial land redistribution policies primarily benefited elite groups, leading to the withdrawal of foreign aid that had been earmarked for such programs. Efforts to reform land use have been sporadic and contentious. Foreign aid has historically prioritized large-scale cash crop plantations over small, family-operated farms. Studies suggest that fostering native crops or employing genetically modified options might enhance food security, though opinions on the best approach remain divided. The complexities of foreign aid and debt. Between 1960 and 1997, African nations received over $500 billion in foreign aid. However, this assistance has yielded limited long-term benefits. Critics argue that foreign aid fosters dependency rather than sustainable growth. By 2005, nations like Ghana and Uganda relied on aid for over 50% of their national budgets. Former Senegalese President Abdoulaye Wade remarked in 2002 that no country has developed through aid alone, advocating instead for free market strategies. High levels of debt further compound Africa's challenges. Many nations' debts have been mismanaged or misappropriated, often funding weapons purchases or lining the pockets of corrupt officials. Newly democratic governments frequently inherit substantial debt from previous regimes, leaving little room for investment in critical public services. By 1996, Africa's collective debt had reached $321 billion, much of which consisted of interest rather than principal amounts. From 1970 to 2008, an estimated $700 billion in capital fled from 33 sub-Saharan African nations. Foreign aid has also been criticized for funding large-scale infrastructure projects with limited utility. Ghana's Akosombo Dam, built for aluminum production, now processes ores imported from other countries due to low-quality local resources. Similarly, large storage silos for cocoa in Ghana remain underutilized as the crop deteriorates quickly. The Aswan High Dam in Egypt, intended to modernize agriculture, has disrupted the Nile's natural fertilization cycle and faces a risk of silt accumulation. Corruption remains pervasive in many African governments, undermining development efforts. While some argue that corrupt administrations are more effective than authoritarian alternatives, the effects of nepotism and bribery are undeniable. Foreign aid often reduces the incentive to address domestic revenue issues, such as improving tax collection systems. From 2012 to 2021, government debt in Sub-Saharan Africa rose from 28% to 57% of GDP, exacerbated by the pandemic's economic fallout. Challenges in human resources. A significant portion of Africa's population endures low wages and unstable employment. Although real wages increased between 2006 and 2017, they have since stagnated. Approximately 85% of Africans live on less than $5.50 per day. Women face additional barriers, frequently earning less than their male counterparts and having limited access to formal employment. The International Labor Organization, ILO, recommends measures such as minimum wage policies and collective bargaining agreements to address these disparities. However, reliance on low-cost labor has perpetuated inefficient agricultural and industrial practices. For example, in Tanzania, gravel production is still conducted manually, reflecting missed opportunities to modernize processes. Educational gaps. Education remains a major hurdle for much of Africa, even in relatively affluent nations. High illiteracy rates persist, despite multilingualism among many Africans. Access to higher education is limited, with only a few institutions in countries like Egypt and South Africa achieving international recognition. The shortage of university graduates, particularly in specialized fields, hinders economic development and perpetuates dependency on foreign expertise. Health and disease burdens. Preventable diseases, particularly those linked to water contamination, remain leading causes of death in Africa, especially among children. The region's water crisis exacerbates these challenges, with untreated sewage often polluting drinking water supplies. While AIDS continues to claim lives, diseases like malaria, tuberculosis, and dysentery collectively have a greater toll. Polio has re-emerged in some areas, driven by misinformation campaigns, and native diseases like sleeping sickness remain difficult to eradicate. Infrastructure deficits. Inadequate infrastructure significantly hinders development across Africa. Basic services, including access to clean water and reliable telecommunications, are often inefficient or unavailable. Rapid urbanization in cities like Lagos and Kinshasa has outpaced the development of essential services, leaving many without safe drinking water or adequate sewage treatment. Colonial infrastructure, designed primarily to connect coastal regions to resource-rich interiors, has left Africa with fragmented transportation networks. While southern Africa boasts a relatively integrated railway system, much of the continent lacks efficient road and rail connections, complicating trade and mobility. The role of conflict and climate change. Conflict remains a persistent issue, often rooted in historical and ethnic divisions, exacerbated by colonial-era boundary drawing. Civil wars and ethnic tensions disrupt development efforts and contribute to widespread displacement. Climate change further exacerbates poverty, increasing the frequency and severity of natural disasters. Poor communities, lacking resources and infrastructure, are particularly vulnerable to these events. The interplay between poverty and climate change creates a vicious cycle, with each issue amplifying the other. The far-reaching effects of poverty. Poverty in Africa has far-reaching consequences, creating a cycle of challenges that perpetuate economic struggles and hinder development. It directly impacts the standard of living and quality of life for the majority of the population. While a small elite and wealthier regions enjoy higher living standards, much of Africa remains deprived of basic consumer goods and services. Africa ranks low on the UN Human Development Index, HDI, with high infant mortality rates, low life expectancy, limited literacy, and insufficient educational opportunities. The continent also faces significant inequality, with the most educated individuals often migrating to the West or the Persian Gulf in search of better prospects. Poverty intensifies the effects of catastrophic events such as famine, which have plagued the continent, especially in the Horn of Africa. These crises are often caused by a combination of factors like war, drought, and plagues of locusts, leading to widespread food shortages and devastating consequences for vulnerable populations. Economic instability, particularly inflation, has been a significant issue in Africa. Many countries faced high annual inflation rates between 1990 and 2002, with some experiencing triple-digit inflation. These economic pressures further hinder the continent's growth and perpetuate the cycle of poverty. Ultimately, poverty in Africa contributes to a self-perpetuating system of disease, conflict, poor governance, and corruption, all of which obstruct efforts to improve living standards and foster sustainable development. The role of terrain in Africa's economic struggles. Africa's enduring struggle with poverty can largely also be traced to the interplay of its geography and history. The continent's vast size spans diverse climates, from arid deserts to dense rainforests, which, while supporting rich ecosystems, present significant barriers to agriculture and trade. For instance, the Sahara Desert isolates Sub-Saharan Africa from the north, acting as a natural trade barrier. Additionally, Africa's rivers, such as the Congo and Niger, are often unnavigable due to waterfalls and rapids, limiting their use for commerce. Unlike Europe or Asia, where navigable rivers and harbors fostered trade and development, Africa's irregular coastline and lack of natural deep-water ports further restrict access to global markets. Compounding these geographical hurdles are the effects of tropical diseases like malaria and sleeping sickness, which debilitate populations and hinder economic productivity. Landlocked countries, accounting for 16 of Africa's 54 nations, face additional economic disadvantages as they rely on neighboring countries for access to ports, inflating trade costs. Colonialism exacerbated these challenges by imposing arbitrary borders that ignored natural geography, dividing ethnic groups and creating fragmented nations. Countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, with immense natural resources, remain underdeveloped due to poor infrastructure and political instability. Despite holding significant reserves of gold, diamonds, and other minerals, the lack of infrastructure and efficient trade networks traps these resources in underutilized potential. Ultimately, Africa's poverty is a multifaceted issue shaped by geography, disease, colonial history, and infrastructure deficits. Addressing these deep-seated challenges requires a nuanced approach, acknowledging the continent's unique barriers and leveraging its untapped wealth and potential. Join us as we continue to uncover the stories shaping Africa and the world. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter.